Um, let's think about water. The biggest thing to think about with water in a container is, will it drain? Will it flow through the length of the growing media to basically get out of your container? You also want to think about the frequency to which you're watering. How often do you water? What's necessary? The last thing you want to think about when it comes to watering in a container garden is, how are you timing it? It's not rocket science to deal with any of these three things, but I'll talk you through it to let you know kind of how I think about it. So, your drainage. Water can't puddle in the container. That's all you want to think about when you're watering and you have a container. You don't want that water sitting for a number of reasons. If you had a bucket, say, and you had one tomato plant in there and there was water puddling, mold will form in that puddle. Mold is the number one problem with tomato plants. The water needs a place to go. In a raised bed, what people often do is they'll put maybe 3-4 inches of gravel at the bottom of the raised bed, and then your soil mix, your potting mix on top of that. That gives a layer about this big to where the water always has a place to go. It won't sit in the soil mix. If you were using a container, a pot, a bucket, a windowsill, you want to think with that in mind. Like, what type of space are you leaving at the bottom for the water to go to? Or does the water have a place to go to leave the container? Remember that too much water is a bad thing. If you have too much water on tomatoes, they actually grow less. If you have too much water on different types of plants, they're not actually able to absorb the nutrients out of the soil. So that leaves you with the next question. How often are you supposed to water? And with a container, it's different than if you're watering out in a field or out in a garden. For watering out in a field or out in a garden, you generally think an inch of water a week. And all you do is you go out there and you put a glass out in your garden, and when you see that you have an inch of water in there, you know that your garden's good for the week. With a container, because you're dealing with a smaller world, you have to do it a little bit more by feel. So you want the soil mix to remain lightly moist and not wet, not puddling. You also want to consider adding a mulch layer to the top of your container, because water moves in two different directions. It'll evaporate out the top, but it'll flow out the bottom. So when you have a container that's full of this potting mix, the water is going to be trying to get out both ways. If you add a mulch layer to the top, you know that you're watering and not oversaturating the garden, but you won't get that evaporation, so you don't necessarily have to worry about it as much. Does that make sense? Please.
How do we deal with our containers that are actually outside in the garden and, in our Chicago summers?
Sure.
Huge deluges of rain where it saturates everything.
Sure. What you do want to do is you may want to have a layer of gravel at the bottom of your pot, or at least make sure that the water can flow out the bottom. But just so the water, having a good soaking isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's just got to be able to move through. So timing your watering, and the only reason I think about timing your watering is when you're growing a plant in your container where you're actually harvesting a fruit or a vegetable. So your tomatoes, your squash, your peppers, things like that. The one thing you don't want to do, you do want to feel your soil every day to check the moisture, and just make sure it's damp to the touch. But you don't want to water before your harvest. And I just put up some tomatoes here. Most plants in containers, they're opportunistic. And so if they get a deluge of water, they're going to take as much of it as they can at the detriment of their fruit. And so they get overloaded with water, they pull up as much as they can, and then your tomatoes start splitting, or your peppers start splitting, or your squash starts splitting. So think about that. If you are looking at your tomatoes and you're like, I'm going to eat that in 3 days, well, maybe after, when you have 2 days to go, don't worry about watering it. It'll be fine. Please.
You said to interrupt with questions. So
Please.
Let's go back to the soil for a second because garden soil, I know what that, if you're digging it up from your yard, but when you go to the home centers or whatever, they have potting soil. Well, that's clear enough, but then there's things that are labeled, garden soil or things like that. And so I'm just wondering if those are okay. And then the other issue is you got a raised bed or a pot and you've had it for a year, grew lots of things last year. Do we need to start, at what point do you
Do you clear it out? Yeah, I think with the garden soil that you would see at like a Home Depot or something like that, it would be important to ask someone there if that specific type that you're looking at is appropriate for a container or for a raised bed, mostly because you just kind of want to know if it is actually going to be able to drain. And there are big like soil to the first place I think of is a place called Lake Street Supply on Lake and basically Western. And you can buy all different types of potting mixes there, but not all of them are appropriate for a raised bed. There are some that might be great for a garden, but you're going to want to ask, is this soil mix appropriate for a raised bed or a container? And I think that's a fair question to ask. Your second question was, how long before you kind of swap out the whole thing? And I think if you're in a smaller container, the smaller container you're in, the sooner you're going to be pulling out the nutrition that's available in there. You can supplement that nutrition. You could add compost. You could add compost tea. You could be crushing eggshells to be making sure that there's slow release, kind of long-term nutrients being added. The one caveat to that is if you had, say, a small container and you knew for sure that your tomato plant or something else in that family got a mold, I'd get rid of it. Or I just wouldn't plant tomatoes in there anymore because it's just going to continue to spread. So you don't necessarily have to swap it out with any regularity. You just kind of want to think about, after let's say you've been using the same soil for 2 years. Have you added any nutrition to it? Because it's finite. It'll go away if you're not adding to it. Certain plants are very heavy feeders. Cucumbers, members of the squash family, members of the cabbage family. All of these just suck the nutrition out of the soil. So if you're adding nutrients, you don't necessarily have to worry about swapping it out. And like I said before, the disease part is the one thing that I would keep an eye on. Does that make sense? Does anyone have a secondary question to that? Okay. Okay, so timing your watering. Okay, so the third pillar that I think of when it comes to container gardens are pests. And you have two types of pests. You have insects and you have disease. And whether you're dealing with pests in the garden or you're dealing with pests in your container, you still do see them. But the one thing you have to remember is that pests are a symptom. Your plant's trying to tell you something. There's some kind of shortfall in the nutrition of that plant that's making it attractive to, say, a disease or a bug. Bugs don't attack healthy plants. And so if you were to go on out and see that, you've got cucumber beetles on your plant, before I did anything, as far as a pesticide or anything like that, I would be trying some kind of a barrier, some type of thin fabric between the plant and the outside world while I was adding nutrition to the soil. So, if you're thinking, think of your pests in the correct way. The pests aren't the problem. The problem is that your plant isn't getting what it needs, and the pest can tell. Please.
What's wrong with that tomato?
It's a wilt, so it's a fungus. And so usually, if you see a wilt, the first thing I would look at would be, is there standing water in the tomato pot? If it is, then water during a rainstorm can kind of splash up on the plant, and that's how the leaves get infected. Okay, so easiest way to deal with pests, because you're all here, I have a feeling that nobody here is a hands-off gardener. You guys showed up on a freezing winter day to talk about gardening. So what you probably already do is you're looking at your garden. And what are you looking for when you're looking out there? Number one, I'd be looking at the color. Your tomatoes should be dark green, not light green. If they are light green, there's a nutrition issue. I would also be looking at the strength of your plants. You want to see that your plant is growing progressively. So every week, notice if leaves are budding. Notice if there's any height. Notice if the plant is growing wider as well as up. But these are what you're looking for. If not, then my brain would start going towards, I wonder if there's a pest. So in terms of insects, and we could talk all day on pests for plants, and but I only wanted to touch on it, but there's lots of information out there, and I'll do another workshop specifically on pests. We've done that in the past. So for insects in your container garden, what you really want to do first is look at the damage. You can identify the bug by the damage they cause. So this particular bug, $100 question if anyone knows what did this.
Slug.
Caterpillar.
Nope. This is something called a flea beetle, which specifically eats cabbage family. And what they do is they make it look like the leaves on the plant were shot with a shotgun. They punch like 100 holes in the leaf. So if I were to go out to, when I was growing on a large scale, and if I saw plants that had this kind of leaf damage, I already would know that they're in the cabbage family, and I would immediately start thinking that my cabbage family isn't getting enough nitrogen, because cabbage family, that's what they feed on. And if they don't have it, the plant is weak and the bugs know it. So what you want to do is, once you've seen the damage and you know who the bug is, just fight that bug. You don't have to hit it with a sledgehammer when you only have one pest. You don't have to kill everything. What you would want to do is, think of pests, specifically bugs, as two different types. You have soft-shelled ones and you have hard-shelled ones. Hard-shelled ones, if there is a very fine dust that's on the plant that kind of confounds the bug. So if you have the harder shells, there are two different things. Some people use ash as a real fine dust. Other people use something called diatomaceous earth, which is another just very dusty product. Flea beetles will be gone within a day if there was either of those two things on the plant. If you're thinking in terms, let's say you have a type of caterpillar. There are plenty of organic, oils or sprays out there that for soft-bodied insects, they'll be gone in a day, and they aren't harmful products at all. So the big thing, though, is thinking about why is the bug there in the first place? It's because my plant is telling me something. So think about what type of nutrition your plant might need and go from there. So fight the bug, but then think about your nutrition. Please. Yeah. So kale is cabbage. So kale will have this problem. But if you think in terms of things like spinach, lettuce, very hardy. I mean, they can take a freeze. It's not going to bother them. Flea beetles don't bother those two things. Swiss chard is another one. Please.
Only rabbits are the problem.
Rabbits are the problem, but those are things that are really hardy that don't necessarily attract bugs to them. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about different types of disease. Here's another type of, of fungus that's affected. Looks like a basil plant to me. But your first line of defense, specifically in container gardening or raised bed gardening, there are disease-resistant plant varieties for any type of plant you would buy. So if you were to look at tomatoes, you could specifically look, and it'll say on the seed pack, resist Fusarium wilt, resist this type of mold or fungus. Most seed packs will say that. Or if you're buying your seedlings at, like Good Earth Greenhouse or at Home Depot, it'll usually say right on the label what they're resistant to. And it really does make your life easier if you pick the plant that's resistant as opposed to something that is really going to be open game for disease. You have a lot of people who are huge fans of heirloom varieties, and I totally get it because they taste better. Heirloom variety tomatoes are fantastic. They're not really resistant, though. And so you kind of do have to hold their hands the whole way if you want to grow heirloom variety. But if you don't care as much about that, then there are resistant varieties out there for everything you want to grow. If you have a plant like a tomato plant or a basil plant, first thing you're going to want to do is remove the disease portion because it's just going to continue to spread from where it was there. You're going to want to supplement the nutrition, but the last thing to think about in container gardening, if the damage is really bad, don't be afraid to start over. And I think of an analogy of, there were times in the past where I grew on beds that were 5 feet wide and 100 feet long. And I could probably fit 300 tomato plants on one of these beds. But if I woke up one morning and went out and saw that a third of that bed had a wilt, I would mow it into the ground. And then I'd plant carrots or something else. So think of your own gardening with your own scale in mind. But if you were to come out and see some kind of damage, even if it were, say it's August, and you're like, I just gave this whole container all this time for my tomato plants. There are plenty of things that grow well in 30 days. Your garden is not lost no matter what time, if you have to kind of start from scratch. It's kind of a last effort, but, and you generally don't have to do that. You can usually save the plant if you're looking at your garden, a couple times a week, which is the minimum. Yeah, please.
Would you leave the diseased material on soil to rot, or would you throw it in?
I'd get it out of there if I could. If it's possible to get it out of there, I definitely would. Depending on the scale you're working with, if you're not able to get it out of there, the least thing you could do is see what you could do to chop it up so it just breaks down and nature can take care of it. But I'd try to get it out if I could. But keeping in mind that diseases from one plant aren't going to bother another plant, as long as you're thinking of different families. So if you did have a disease that affected your tomatoes or peppers or whatever, think of something in a different family. Maybe plant lettuce, maybe plant carrots. Something, that you're not going to run into a mold issue with these types of things.
You get rid of even your row of tomatoes, you had 10 of 20 were diseased, you get all 20 just gone? Or
I would, it depend on how bad it looked, I think. I would hate to do it, and it would be the last thing I would do, but at the same time, I wouldn't want to say, well, I can't grow anything here anymore either. That's it. That's exactly right. So, just because you have a tomato disease in your container doesn't mean you got to get rid of the container. You can plant something else. So tomatoes are specifically in the nightshade family. So that's tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, and potatoes. That's it. If you're planting outside of that, then you should theoretically be okay. As a generalization. But yeah.